we've talked about a couple of your race cars, but something that I kind of think is kind of neat is these Lotus cars you have. You've got quite a collection of Lotuses. And so why don't you tell us a little bit? I know we've got several different desirable styles of Lotus cars in this collection. And so let's start out with the 61 Lotus 2022 F1 car. Can you tell us a little bit more about that other than what we already know, which is the bullet points? Give us the story why you like these F1 cars and why you started dealing with Lotus cars.
Well, here, it's kind of an interesting story. Again, with all my racing in Europe, unlike most people who grew up karting and then grew up after karting, they started racing Formula 2000s or Formula Fords and then Formula 3000s and eventually worked their way up to Formula One. I was working with Ferrari on lots of other things. And when they decided to start the F1 Cliente program, they came to me and said, we'd like you to be the first customer to buy a car in the new program. There are other people who have been driving the cars before that, but in this new program. So I went directly into Formula One. I sort of skipped all that early racing because I just sort of had a knack for it. And I loved it. But one day, one of my best friends, Larry Kinch, who's also got a beautiful collection of cars, was in F1 Cliente. He had some of these Lotuses in his collection, which were called Formula Juniors. So there were different series with Formula Junior and Formula One back in the 1960s. And he said, Tony, you've got to learn how to drive these cars because they'll teach you to be a better driver. They're the best experience in the world. And I'm looking at him going, yeah, but they're tiny. And how exciting can that be? Oh my God, were they exciting? I learned how to slide a car. I learned how to drive a car better than ever in any other car I've ever raced by driving that car. And so when you look at the formula, and I'll start with it in a way, it's like there are Formula Juniors and Formula Ones. And the primary difference between the two in that period was the same chassis, whether it was a 2022 or a 22. The Lotuses all were the same body, the same chassis. The only difference between the F1 cars and the Formula Juniors was a larger displacement engine and bigger rear wheels. So
yeah, I was gonna say tire size, yeah.
Yeah, the tire size. So I didn't start with the F1. I actually started with the Juniors, and I bought my first one. And then I thought, well, I better buy a second one because if you're a race driver, you'll know there's nothing worse than going to a track, having a car problem, and then sitting around all weekend. So I bought two so I could always know that I'd have a car. So I got a 22, it's one of the ones we'll talk about, and a 2022. And I started falling in love with it. And then, of course, my buddy Larry, he's like, yeah, but I finished the race. Now I'm going to the Formula One, and you have to sit on the sides. And I'm going, wait, I want a Formula One. And they were more expensive, but I was like, okay. So I started looking for one. And I came across it in an auction where they didn't know what it was. And I went ahead and did the research on it. And this particular Lotus 2022 was originally a Formula Junior like they all were. And then it became an F1 car. And it was raced in the New Zealand Grand Prix Formula One race by a very famous driver, a New Zealand driver. And oh my God, just for a second, the name escapes me. I'll have to come back to that part. Anyway, a Palmer. Why am I having a problem? Palmer. Anyway, I'll get the name and I'll give you that detail. But anyway, he raced it in this race, and he raced in this race against some of the most famous drivers, like God. See, now you got me going down a path I lost track for a second.
Let's fine. Just take a breath here just a second and just relax. We got all the time in the world.
Anyway, it was a 1961 New Zealand Grand Prix. They outfitted the car in his stable of cars. And there was, years ago, people thought, well, this is that one, this one. So I traced it back and I got documentation that shows this was the actual car that was raced in New Zealand by him, sanctioned as a Formula One and FIA registered as a Formula One car. So that car became the car that I wanted to race, but to race it, someone had already converted it back to a Formula Junior, put the smaller tires and a Formula Junior engine in it. So I reached out.
It didn't make sense to go back.
Right. So what I did is I said, no. This car is much more valuable. It's a Formula One car. So I contracted the #1 Lotus guy in England. I think it was Jeff Richardson, and I'll again verify that. And my buddy Larry, who used it for years, I said, I need the Formula One engine back in this car. He built it from the ground up brand new, redone the entire engine in the car, and it's literally perfect. And outside of testing the engine, it's never been driven yet, so it's still race ready and brand new. I installed it in the car, where it's now sitting in my house in Germany. The engine got installed, and by the time I went to go race it, all these other things had happened. And like I said, I had just retired from racing. So I have this beautiful car that is so rare, as a 61 F1 with a brand new engine in it. So whoever gets this car is going to have this incredible, like, super fast Formula One car that qualifies for the European and US FIA F1 championship.
Yeah, that's amazing. And now that car is located in Germany and will be sold in Germany at your location at the prime of the sale. We have 2 cars over there, correct?
We actually have 3 cars there.
Or 3 cars, excuse me, yeah, right. And then we have the Schumacher motorhome, but yes.
Exactly. And while I'm on it, I might as well go to the Lotus 22,
Right.
which was the first of the Lotuses I bought. And just so people get the distinction of what those cars are, what that means, a Lotus 20 was the first iteration of the Lotus cars. Since the first one was a Lotus 18, and they switched from the Lotus 18 to the Lotus 20, where they took this body style, the rear engine, and they had, I believe it was drum brakes in the back and discs in the front, if my memory serves correct. So what they did is they started taking the 20s for racing the next season, putting the disc brakes all the way around, and they made it a Lotus 2022. Then they evolved it to a much slightly different but more improved version of that car called the Lotus 22. And the 22 itself is the first one I ever bought. I bought it from a guy in France who successfully raced it. It's the first one I got in and raced that I owned. And I took it out at, I think it was Silverstone was the first place I took it out. I have to check. I got in the car, and it taught me how to drive. It really did. It taught me how to completely drive on a racetrack in a different way than I had in Formula One. And anybody who wants to become a phenomenal driver in a very safe car, for what it is in 1961, the Lotus 20s and 20 and 22s are great cars. So I got this French car, and that's when I went to go look for a 2022 and a 2022 spare for US, so I didn't have to ship cars back and forth. So I ended up with my F1 and my 22 in Europe, and in the United States, I bought 2 more 2022s, and those are the 2 that are most of the way through a full restoration, but I raced them before that. I raced the 22 all over Europe. It raced in the where they had the Formula One race last weekend, in the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort. I raced it there. Phenomenal track for this car. So I raced it all over Europe. The car is in great shape. It's still race ready. You can get in it, take it out onto a track and drive it tomorrow. It's got, I think I've got spares of tires and things with it in Germany. And then the 2022s are, I got them. They're here in the United States. They're halfway through restoration. They'll be beautifully done. The new owners can pick the color scheme of the cars. Although I'm fond of the Lotus green. That's that British racing green. That's Lotus's color.
If they want to paint it pink and yellow, they can.
We'll paint the cars part of the sale, and we're going to finish the restoration on those 2 cars. So they'll be going out with brand new cars on either of those 61 2022s.